Silent Pennsylvania. In a quiet corner, Pennsylvania, the ground is still burning. No flames, no sirens, just a warm breath of smoke rising from the earth. The last heartbeat of a town that vanished almost overnight. This is Centralia, a town erased by fire, swallowed slowly by the land beneath it. In the rolling hills of eastern Pennsylvania, tucked quietly among the pine and oak forests, lay a small town. A town like any other, yet destined to become anything but ordinary. This was Centralia. In the 1950s and early 1960s, life here moved with the gentle rhythm of coal mining America. Smoke curled lazily from brick chimneys. Children walked down tree-lined streets, and neighbors waved from the wooden porches of their homes. Centralia was built around coal. Black seams ran deep beneath the hills, hidden from view but shaping every life above. Miners rose before dawn, boots crunching against frozen paths, lamps swinging lightly in hand. Families depended on these seams. The townspeople were close-knit, sharing Sunday dinners, stories, and the kind of small talk that lingered long after the words were spoken. It was a simple, ordinary existence, yet, as with so many quiet towns, it carried its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. To this ordinary town, we introduce Anna, a young fictional journalist who often imagines the past. Though she arrived decades later, she senses the echoes of life once lived here. She imagines the children running barefoot across the streets in the summer, the clatter of pickaxes mingling with laughter, the scent of fresh bread wafting from small kitchens. Through Anna's eyes, we step softly into a world that seems frozen in time, yet vibrant with memory. The town's main street stretched in a gentle curve, lined with modest brick stores and wooden homes. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling into the sky as if marking the town's existence with a quiet exhalation. The local general store smelled of coal dust and powdered sugar. Anna imagines the gentle cadence of these voices, how they would rise and fall with the firelight, the soft crackle of coal heating the room. It was a time when life and labor were intertwined, and when each person, whether miner or homemaker, knew their place within the delicate rhythm of Centralia. Yet beneath this quiet existence lay a hidden current, one unnoticed and often ignored. The coal seams that sustained life also held danger, a slow, simmering power that could, one day, erupt. Residents knew of the risks in passing, as miners occasionally spoke of smoke from forgotten shafts or pockets of gas, but these warnings were distant whispers, easily dismissed. To most, the ground beneath their feet was steady, reliable, unchanging. Anna imagines Tom and Sarah, a fictional young couple, walking hand in hand along the frost-lined streets. Tom, a miner's son, feels a subtle warmth beneath his boots, something not quite right, yet easily ignored. Sarah senses it too, a slight unease, but smiles anyway, trusting the rhythm of their daily life. These small, imagined details humanize the town, allowing us to feel what the residents might have felt without altering the historical record. The town's church bell rang each Sunday, echoing across the hills, a familiar pulse of order in an otherwise quiet world. Centralia's residents lived in harmony with the land, relying on it, yet rarely considering its hidden dangers. Each family had a story, a lineage tied to coal, to timber, to the quiet streets where children's laughter filled the air. Anna walks these streets in our story, listening for echoes,
watching shadows lengthen across weathered wood and brick, imagining the vibrancy of lives long past. Schools were small with low ceilings and wooden floors. Children learned arithmetic, reading, and the basics of a world still reliant on coal and iron. Teachers called out names, footsteps shuffled, and the occasional squeak of chalk against the blackboard punctuated the otherwise quiet rooms.
Anna envisions herself peering through one of these windows, catching glimpses of children with bright eyes, unaware of the slow danger lurking beneath. The town streets were lined with utility poles, and the occasional horse-drawn cart creaked along the road. A subtle hum of everyday life enveloped the town, conversations drifting through open windows, laughter spilling from front porches, and the clinking of tools as miners prepared for the next day. Anna imagines stepping lightly between these streets, absorbing the atmosphere, noting the harmony between humans and the land, blissfully unaware of the underground fire that would one day alter the town forever. Centralia was ordinary in every way. Its charm lay in its simplicity, in the human rhythm synchronized with the hills and seams below. The town existed in a delicate balance, a life built on the wealth of coal, a community knit tightly by shared labor and mutual reliance. Anna, through her imagined presence, allows us to enter this world gently, experiencing the town as both observer and participant. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across wooden fences and brick chimneys, the town prepared for another quiet night. Residents closed windows, tended small fires, and said their evening prayers. The world outside continued fast and unknowable, while Centralia remained a small, sleepy corner, perfectly ordinary, yet, as we know now, poised on the edge of a slow, unstoppable change. And so we leave Centralia for now, walking alongside Anna, feeling the calm, the nostalgia, and the unspoken stories carried by the streets and the hills. Life here was simple, vibrant in its ordinariness, and entirely human. Soon the ground would whisper, and the town would change forever. But in this moment, in this silent Pennsylvania town, life breathed steadily, gently, and unremarkably, as all life does before history intervenes. The morning the fire began, Centralia looked like any other quiet Pennsylvania town. A soft June mist hovered over the rolling hills, carrying with it the scent of coal dust and wild mountain laurel. By then, coal mining was more memory than livelihood, but the town still felt anchored to the black rock beneath its feet, steady, unchanging, dependable. It would be the last summer Centralia ever felt ordinary. Even today, when people look back on that fateful year, 1962, they point to one day, one decision, one mistake. But the truth is more complicated. Fires don't simply start, they build. They wait. They linger in the edges of negligence, in paperwork nobody bothered to file, in warnings whispered but never heeded. The fire in Centralia wasn't just an accident. It was a story of small mistakes piling up until the earth itself caught flame. The landfill sat in an old strip mine pit on the town's outskirts. It wasn't pretty, just a jagged mouth carved into the earth, filled with discarded furniture, bags of household waste, rusted metal, and the unmentionable leftovers of a mining town struggling to modernize. The locals hated the smell, but it was convenient, cheap, out of sight. And because Memorial Day was approaching, the borough council wanted the landfill cleaned. The solution had always been the same: burn it. Burning trash was common practice in coal towns, simple, fast, and usually harmless. The firefighters would light a controlled blaze, watch it for a few hours, spread the ashes, and call it a day. No one thought much of it. After all, what could go wrong?
On May 27, 1962, 5 firefighters arrived at the landfill with hoses, rakes, and an understanding that this would be routine. They set the pile alight, the flames licking upward in the humid air. Old newspapers curled into black petals. Rubber hissed. Bottles burst. The fire roared, then calmed, settling into the familiar crackling of a town tradition. When the flames died down, the firefighters doused the embers. They poked through the ash, ensuring nothing smoldered. Or so they thought. Beneath the landfill lay a narrow opening, small, almost invisible, leading into abandoned mine shafts. Some claimed they saw it, some claimed they didn't. It hardly mattered. By the time the fire was out on the surface, embers had already slipped past that opening, tumbling into a labyrinth of coal seams carved more than a century earlier. Down there among forgotten tunnels and pillars of anthracite, the embers found oxygen, fuel. They settled into the earth like seeds and began to grow. The first signs were subtle, a faint smell drifting through the streets at night, a strange heat radiating from a patch of ground near the highway, kids kicking up warm dust while playing baseball. People noticed, of course, but coal towns always smelled of coal, always breathed heat. Nobody wanted to make trouble. Nobody imagined the fire was still alive and spreading like veins of lightning beneath their shoes. It took weeks before the borough council admitted concern. Weeks more before they sent someone to inspect the mine openings. By July, they brought in a mining inspector named Frank Kovach, a quiet man with tired eyes and 20 years of coal experience behind him. He lowered a thermometer into a borehole near the landfill. The reading shot past 150 degrees Fahrenheit, then 200, then 300. Kovach pulled the device out, sweat darkening his shirt. This isn't normal. This ground shouldn't be this hot. He recommended sealing the mine entrances. The council said they'd discuss it. They didn't act quickly enough.
By late summer, the fire had carved its way deeper into the coal seam. The heat was rising, not evenly but in pulses, like the earth was struggling to breathe. Residents began reporting small sinkholes, soft spots in the soil that buckled under pressure. Wisps of smoke curled from cracks in the ground after rainstorms. Dogs barked at nothing. Birds avoided the area entirely. Still, people told themselves it would pass. Centralia was a town built on hard work and stubbornness. You didn't panic over odd smells or warm ground. You went to church, you went to work, you minded your business. But the earth had other plans. In early autumn, a town meeting was held in the fire hall. Families packed into the room, standing shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled of sweat, coffee, and faint panic. "We have a situation," Councilman Dombrowski began, tapping his papers nervously. "There's heat beneath the mine, possibly a small fire." "A small fire?" someone shouted. "My backyard is smoking." A murmur spread. For the first time, fear took root. Mining Inspector Kovach stood up. "It's not small. It's moving. The seam under Centralia runs deep and connects to older tunnels. If we don't act now, this could last years." "Years?" a woman whispered. "Or decades," Kovach added quietly. The room fell silent. But the borough had limited funds. The state had other priorities. The federal government didn't take the threat seriously. And all the while, underground, the fire grew hotter. By the end of 1962, the warm patches became hot enough to melt the soles of shoes. The baseball field developed a long crack that exhausted white vapor on cold mornings. The smell of sulfur seeped into basements. People began to worry about their children, especially after young boys discovered they could toss pebbles into steaming holes and hear them rattle endlessly downward. Local miners,
Those few who still worked the remaining operations stopped laughing at the rumors. They knew what a burning seam meant. They had seen it in other states. They knew how unstoppable fire could be when it found coal. But even they didn't grasp the full scale. No one did. Not yet. That December, Centralia tried to pretend everything was fine. The church lit its usual candles. Children sang carols on a stage warmed not by heaters, but by a quiet, unnatural heat seeping up from the ground. Parents shared uneasy glances. The fire was still moving, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. You don't want to admit when your home is sick. You don't want to believe the earth beneath you is turning against you. Centralia didn't know it then, but this would be their last Christmas as a complete town, intact, optimistic, unbroken. When the snows came in January of 1963, they melted instantly upon touching certain patches of ground. Steam curled upward in thick, ghostly walls. The local paper printed photos of the phenomenon, strange white fog pooling across the roads. That's when the whispers began. It's spreading. It's getting hotter. It's headed toward town. The state finally intervened. Engineers drilled boreholes and lowered gas detectors. The readings came back. Carbon monoxide, high levels, dangerous levels. The fire wasn't slowing. It was accelerating. What burned in 1962 as a spark had become a force, a hidden inferno stretching miles beneath the earth, eating its way through generations of abandoned tunnels. Centralia had awakened something ancient, powerful, and unstoppable. Looking back, the tragedy of Centralia wasn't only the fire. It was the chain reaction of human decisions. The landfill placed on top of old mine tunnels, the lack of a clay barrier, the rushed holiday cleanup, the insufficient inspections, the delayed government response. No single decision doomed the town, but together, they lit a fuse. The fire beneath Centralia was never meant to exist. It was a mistake, simple, human, ordinary. And yet it would destroy homes, memories, land, and the very identity of a town that had survived for generations. What started as a routine Memorial Day cleanup became an inferno that even 60 years later still burns beneath the silent, empty streets. A fire that shouldn't have been. A fire that refused to die. A fire that turned Centralia into a ghost of itself. And all it took was one spark in a landfill, a spark that found a way into the dark heart of the earth and never came back out. The town of Centralia had begun to understand the ground beneath their feet was no longer neutral soil. The warmth that once seemed subtle was now unmistakable, spreading through the streets, rising from basements, curling along cracks in asphalt. By early 1964, what had begun as a spark beneath the old landfill had grown into something far larger, far more dangerous, an underground inferno that refused to die. It moved silently, patiently, consuming coal seams and forgotten tunnels, breathing smoke and gas into places no one expected. The residents, once dismissive, had learned to fear it. Every footstep was cautious. Every morning brought a faint haze, a lingering scent of sulfur, and an eerie vibration beneath their shoes.
In late January, small sinkholes began appearing along Route 61 and scattered residential streets. Patches of ground glowed faintly, heat radiating upward even in the dead of night. Drivers noticed unusual warmth seeping through tires as they parked. A man walking his dog paused mid-step, feeling the earth tremble under him. The dog whimpered, and he hurried home. Even the engineers who had visited in previous months expressed unease. "We've never seen a coal seam fire act like this," one whispered to a colleague, eyes scanning the faint smoke that rose through abandoned roads. It's moving faster than calculations allow. It's alive in a way we cannot measure. The town, once filled with the normal rhythms of coal dust and quiet domestic life, now felt alive with menace. Centralia's streets whispered warnings to anyone willing to listen. Carbon monoxide readings were climbing. Gas detectors sounded alarms in areas previously considered safe. Residents reported headaches, nausea, dizziness. Windows were left open in winter, letting in the cold, but it did little to disperse the underground fumes. At night, the ground hissed like an invisible furnace. Even simple acts, walking to the mailbox, tending a garden, carried the risk of inhaling poisonous gas or stepping into a suddenly collapsed patch of heated earth. The fire beneath Centralia was no longer a curiosity. It had become a force of nature, indifferent to life above, moving like a river of heat and smoke beneath the foundations of every home, every street, every memory.
The Millers, who had lived in a small brick house near the main street, were among the first to notice the extent of the danger. Their basement had begun to emit faint orange light at night, a subtle glow that made the shadows dance unnaturally. The smell of sulfur grew stronger, carrying with it a sense of unease. One morning, Mr. Miller tried to dig a small trench to divert water from the basement. His shovel struck warm earth, and a plume of smoke shot upward. He stumbled back, coughing, realizing that the fire beneath wasn't just under the landfill, it was creeping beneath the very foundations of his home. Stories like this spread quickly through the town. Children were no longer allowed near the cracked streets. Even teenagers, usually fearless, began testing the ground cautiously, tossing small stones into fissures to see if they would land safely or tumble into an unseen abyss. By February, Centralia's Borough Council convened emergency meetings. Engineers presented detailed reports highlighting the accelerated spread of the underground fire. Maps showed a patchwork of affected areas, heat zones, and gas concentrations. "This isn't going to burn out naturally," one engineer warned. "The fire is self-sustaining. It has fuel, oxygen, and pathways beneath the town. If we don't take action, this will continue for decades." Fear and stubbornness collided. Many residents were hesitant to leave. Centralia was home, the place where generations had lived, worked, and died. Accepting that their streets, their yards, and even their houses were no longer safe was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, families began to take precautions. Basements were abandoned. Windows were left open to ventilate, and some residents installed rudimentary gas monitors. Children were kept close. Pets were brought indoors. The town had learned, slowly, to respect the power beneath. Anna, the local chronicler, continued her meticulous notebook. She had spent countless hours walking the streets, noting where smoke emerged from cracks, which areas radiated heat, and how the earth seemed to breathe beneath her feet. She recorded her observations in detailed sketches and diagrams, the sort of careful documentation that historians would later marvel at. Tom and Sarah, the young couple near the outskirts, made nightly inspections of their property. They discovered faint cracks forming in the lawn and small wisps of smoke rising near the garage. Each night they measured temperature and noted the intensity of the gas smell. Every evening was a tense negotiation with the earth beneath them, a delicate balancing act between normal life and imminent danger. Even older residents, the miners who had spent decades underground, walked differently now. They carried the wisdom of experience and the instinctive respect for coal fires. But this underground inferno was unlike anything they had seen. It did not roar or explode, it simmered, crept, and watched. By March, Centralia began to witness structural consequences. Small sinkholes swallowed sections of sidewalk. Pavement cracked spontaneously, revealing faint orange glow beneath. Residents reported doors that became stuck, floors that sagged, and walls that seemed warmer to the touch than they should be. The Miller's home developed a small but growing fissure in the backyard. Mr. Miller measured the heat and gas, recording numbers that made his stomach churn.
Anna sketched the fissure in her notebook, carefully noting the plume of smoke rising with each wind gust. Every fissure told a story, every vent a warning, and the town was beginning to realize that their foundations, both literal and emotional, were no longer secure. The streets of Centralia grew quieter. Mailboxes remained empty more often than not. Children no longer played freely. Cars passed cautiously, avoiding suspicious patches of road. Even the animals sensed the danger. Dogs hesitated, cats vanished from the streets, and birds circled overhead without landing. The town had become a living organism, reacting to the threat beneath. Every crack and vent was a pulse, a reminder that life above ground was fragile and contingent upon what lay below. State engineers returned frequently, monitoring temperature, gas levels, and ground stability. Each time they left, their reports were grim. The fire had reached sections of old mine tunnels thought isolated. Carbon monoxide readings were dangerously high, approaching levels lethal for anyone exposed for more than a few hours. The engineers urged the Burham to evacuate, at least partially, but many residents resisted. Memories, homes, and the stubborn attachment to Centralia clashed with the rational fear of the underground inferno. Amid the growing danger, human stories continued. Families tried to maintain routines, dinners, chores, church services, but everything carried a shadow of the fire below. Conversations were quieter, laughter muted, and steps more careful. Even small gestures, a child picking a flower, a neighbor greeting another across the street, felt weighted with awareness of the invisible threat. Tom and Sarah continued their nightly inspections, but one evening they discovered a new vent forming dangerously close to the garage. The heat radiated unnaturally, smoke curling in thick white columns. They realized the fire wasn't static, it was moving, spreading beneath the town like a slow, patient predator. By mid-1964, Centralia's residents had accepted a new reality. The town itself was alive with danger. The underground fire would not stop. It was a persistent, patient, and unstoppable force. The underground inferno was more than coal and flames. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and vigilance. The town had been given a reminder of the power beneath human civilization, a silent, relentless force that did not need eyes, hands, or a voice to command respect. At dusk, the streets appeared normal to the untrained eye, but faint wisps of smoke rose from cracks in the asphalt. Heat radiated through the pavements, gentle but insistent. Steam drifted from backyards and abandoned homes. The town, once lively, had grown quiet, its pulse measured, careful, aware. Even as families adapted, the underground fire remained patient, powerful, and relentless. It would not die quickly. It would not vanish. It would continue, slowly consuming coal seams and tunnels, beneath streets, houses, and memories. The town of Centralia had learned, at last, to fear what lay beneath, and in that fear, they also learned to respect it.
Centralia had been a town of whispers for years, a place where the ground beneath homes and streets harbored a secret. Residents had learned to respect the heat, the smoke, and the subtle warnings from the earth. But no one anticipated that the invisible fire beneath would one day announce itself in a way that could not be ignored. That day arrived on a quiet June morning in 1969. The sun had barely risen over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania when Todd Domboski, a young boy of 9, walked to the abandoned strip mine near his home. He had often explored the edges of town, chasing frogs, throwing stones into fissures, and pretending he was an adventurer in a land untouched by adults. That morning, however, the earth had other plans. Todd's sneakers scuffed against the gravel as he approached the familiar clearing near the mine. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, though he hardly noticed it. Kids often ignored the faint smoke and warmth that rose from patches of ground. They were part of the town's background, as ordinary as the sound of coal trains in the distance. He bent down to toss a rock into a small fissure, one that had been growing over months. The rock tumbled into the crack with a hollow echo, and for a brief moment, nothing seemed unusual. Then the earth shifted beneath him. A sudden drop,
A yawning hole that had been hidden by grass and debris swallowed Todd's legs up to his knees.
He fell with a startled cry, hands clutching at the edges, mud and warm earth clinging to his clothes. Smoke curled up from the hole, and the heat radiated from below, intense enough to make him recoil. Neighbors rushing to help later described the scene with wide eyes, a boy dangling over the invisible fire beneath, the earth trembling in ways no one could have imagined. Todd's incident transformed Centralia from a quiet, mysterious town into a national story overnight. Newspapers carried photographs of the small sinkhole and the boy's rescue, accompanied by alarming headlines, "Town on fire beneath its feet," and "Coal seam fire threatens residents." Suddenly, people who had once dismissed the smoke and warmth as quirks of an old coal town understood that the threat was real, immediate, and dangerous. Centralia's underground fire could no longer be considered an abstract problem. It was a tangible danger capable of swallowing a child. Television crews arrived, filming the cracked streets, steam rising from pavement fissures, and the trembling earth around homes. Engineers and geologists were brought in from across the country to assess the situation, each expressing grave concern at the fire's unpredictability. The incident sparked a wave of fear that swept through Centralia like wildfire. Parents kept children close, even inside their homes, where the faint warmth and sulfuric smell now seemed threatening rather than curious. Families who had tolerated the smoke and heat for years began to pack belongings and consider leaving. Even homes previously considered safe now felt precarious. Small cracks appeared in foundations, pavement shifted, and faint plumes of smoke rose where no one had expected. The town had learned to fear the ground, but Todd's fall made that fear concrete, undeniable, and personal. State engineers returned in force, conducting tests on the area surrounding the incident. Thermometers, gas detectors, and borehole cameras revealed the scale of the danger. Carbon monoxide readings were alarming. Ground temperatures had reached levels higher than ever recorded. One engineer, a tall man with thinning hair and a calm voice, spoke to a gathered crowd. "This is no ordinary underground fire. It moves unpredictably. The sinkhole that swallowed Todd is a warning. The ground can shift, collapse, or emit poisonous gases without notice. Evacuation is recommended." For the residents, these warnings were terrifying but also painfully clear. Centralia's foundations, both physical and emotional, were no longer safe. Todd recovered physically, though the incident left psychological scars that lingered for years. He became a symbol, an unwitting hero of the town's struggle against the fire below. His story circulated in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television segments. Parents and officials alike used his near tragedy as a rallying point. Meetings, inspections, and emergency plans multiplied. Centralia had long lived with quiet fear, but Todd's accident made that fear visible, palpable, unavoidable. Children were no longer allowed near the outskirts of town. Adults walked cautiously. Even pets avoided certain streets instinctively. Todd's fall had changed the way everyone understood the fire beneath their feet. National media descended upon Centralia. Cameras captured steam rising from streets, smoke from cracks, and the eerie orange glow beneath asphalt fissures. Engineers, journalists, and concerned officials were interviewed, emphasizing the town's danger. The story captivated the nation, a town literally burning from below, a coal seam fire that had eluded control for years. And now, proof that the threat could affect anyone, even a child. Centralia was no longer just a Pennsylvania curiosity. It was a cautionary tale of neglect, persistence, and the invisible power of the earth. Fear rippled through the residents. Families who had hesitated to leave
finally began to accept the reality their homes were unsafe. Streets that once held the laughter of children became quiet, ghostly. The sidewalks themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the heat beneath their feet. Neighborhood meetings were held daily. Engineers, council members, and residents debated evacuation strategies. Some refused to leave, clinging to memories, homes, and traditions. Others, guided by the stark lesson of Todd's fall, prepared to abandon Centralia entirely. The town learned quickly that the underground fire was patient, and that patience was dangerous. Among the remaining residents, human stories unfolded quietly. Anna, the local chronicler, documented Todd's accident and its aftermath with meticulous notes and sketches. She recorded the heat zones, gas vents, and newly forming cracks in streets and yards. Tom and Sarah, the young couple, reinforced their home's foundation and measured every fissure that appeared nearby. Each night became a careful negotiation with the invisible fire beneath them. Every creak in the floors, every faint puff of smoke from a vent reminded them that life above ground was fragile, contingent upon forces beyond their control. The Todd Domboski incident accelerated intervention. State and federal agencies proposed measures, drilling boreholes, sealing abandoned tunnels, and continuous monitoring. The fire, however, refused to be tamed. Coal seams beneath Centralia burned with persistence, creating a hazard that could not be entirely controlled. Residents realized that no matter the human effort, the earth had its own rules. Their connection to the land, once considered secure, had become precarious. The ground beneath Centralia had asserted itself in the most undeniable way. Todd's fall changed more than the town's daily routines. It reshaped public perception, sparked national conversation about mine safety and abandoned coal towns, and highlighted the consequences of long-ignored hazards. Centralia became an emblem of a slow-moving disaster, an underground inferno whose reach touched the lives of every resident. People learned to fear with precision, respect with caution, and adapt with patience. Even as streets emptied and homes were abandoned, the town's memory persisted, captured in photographs, newspaper stories, government reports, and the experiences of those who had survived. Todd Domboski's near tragedy was a reminder that danger can be invisible, patient, and unrelenting, and that sometimes it only takes one misstep to illuminate what lies beneath. By twilight, the streets of Centralia were silent but alive with tension. Fissures exhaled smoke in faint columns. Heat radiated through cracked asphalt and broken sidewalks. The town, once bustling with children's laughter and neighbors' chatter, now held a quiet vigilance. Every resident, from the youngest to the oldest, moved with care. They walked gently, listened intently, and observed constantly. Todd's incident had become a symbol, a warning etched into memory. The underground fire beneath Centralia continued, patient and unstoppable. A hidden inferno that had changed the town forever.
Centralia had long been a town defined by coal, history, and quiet resilience. For decades, residents lived with the underground fire beneath their feet, adapting to its heat, its smoke, and the subtle warning signs it provided. But by the mid-1970s, the invisible threat became too tangible, too impossible to ignore. Government buyouts were offered to families, a solution that promised safety but demanded something far more difficult: leaving home. The first notices arrived by mail, crisp envelopes stamped with official seals. They contained letters from the state, carefully worded to reassure, yet unmistakably clear. The town's underground fire was a hazard, and families were eligible for relocation funds. Some residents scoffed, folding the letters with practiced disinterest. They had lived with smoke, heat, and cracked streets for years.
Why should they abandon homes that had held generations, homes that held birthdays, anniversaries, and memories? Others, however, read the letters with trembling hands. The warnings about gas, heat, and unstable ground suddenly felt very real. Children played cautiously near fissures. Steam rose from asphalt cracks in the early morning fog. Among those contemplating the buyouts were the Millers, an older couple who had raised 3 children in their modest brick house near the outskirts. Their home smelled faintly of sulfur in the basements, and small cracks had begun appearing along the foundation. Mr. Miller shook his head as he held the government letter. "I built this house with my own hands," he said, voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Miller's eyes wandered toward the garden, where the flowers still bloomed defiantly despite the heat below. "I know, Harold, but we can't ignore what's happening underneath. What if the sinkholes come for us next?" The couple argued quietly in the evenings, torn between the tangible love for their home and the invisible threat lurking below. The buyouts fractured the town in subtle ways. Some families accepted immediately, taking the money and moving with relief.
Centralia had long been a town defined by coal, history, and quiet resilience. For decades, residents lived with the underground fire beneath their feet, adapting to its heat, its smoke, and the subtle warning signs it provided. But by the mid-1970s, the invisible threat became too tangible, too impossible to ignore. Government buyouts were offered to families, a solution that promised safety, but demanded something far more difficult: leaving home. The first notices arrived by mail, crisp envelopes stamped with official seals. They contained letters from the state, carefully worded to reassure, yet unmistakably clear. The town's underground fire was a hazard, and families were eligible for relocation funds. Some residents scoffed, folding the letters with practiced disinterest. They had lived with smoke, heat, and cracked streets for years. Why should they abandon homes that had held generations? Homes that held birthdays, anniversaries, and memories. Others, however, read the letters with trembling hands. The warnings about gas, heat, and unstable ground suddenly felt very real. Children played cautiously near fissures. Steam rose from asphalt cracks in the early morning fog. Among those contemplating the buyout were the Millers, an older couple who had raised 3 children in their modest brick house near the outskirts. Their home smelled faintly of sulfur in the basement, and small cracks had begun appearing along the foundation. Mr. Miller shook his head as he held the government letter. "I built this house with my own hands," he said, voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Miller's eyes wandered toward the garden, where the flowers still bloomed defiantly despite the heat below. "I know, Harold, but we can't ignore what's happening underneath. What if the sinkholes come for us next?" The couple argued quietly in the evenings, torn between the tangible love for their home and the invisible threat lurking below. The buyouts fractured the town in subtle ways. Some families accepted immediately, taking the money and moving with relief, packing up generations of belongings in trucks and vans. Others refused, clinging stubbornly to their streets, their houses, and their memories. Neighbors whispered in tense circles. Some criticized the holdouts as foolish. Others judged the movers as weak or disloyal. Friendships that had lasted decades began to strain under the moral weight of the choice: leave to survive or stay to preserve history. At the local diner, conversations grew hushed. Patrons spoke in low tones about which streets were safe, which homes had new cracks, and which families were planning to accept the buyouts. The town's rhythm shifted subtly,
like a heartbeat slowing before a storm. Tom and Sarah, the young couple who had lived near the town's edge, faced a similar dilemma. Their home had small fissures in the lawn and a faint hiss from the basement, yet they hesitated. Leaving meant abandoning their first home together, the place where they had celebrated holidays, painted nursery walls, and planted their first tree. Meanwhile, Anna, the town chronicler, observed the unfolding conflict with a careful, detached eye. She recorded stories of families packing, families arguing, and families who simply stayed, watching the smoke rise from the asphalt with quiet dread. Every home held a story, every street a decision, and the invisible fire beneath forced each resident to confront what mattered most. State officials and engineers returned regularly, presenting updated reports on the underground fire. Maps displayed expanding heat zones, fissures, and vents. Gas readings were higher than ever in certain streets. Experts urged residents to consider the buyouts seriously. The government offered generous compensation packages designed to encourage families to relocate. Yet no amount of money could replicate the intangible value of a lifetime of memories, a neighborhood of friends, and a town that had been home for generations. Some residents walked the streets silently after meetings, staring at the cracked pavement and imagining the invisible fire inching beneath their feet. The dilemma was as moral as it was practical. The choice was safety versus legacy, survival versus sentiment. The Miller family debated endlessly. Mr. Miller wanted to leave, fearing the fire's growing unpredictability. Mrs. Miller wanted to stay, believing their love for the home and memories was stronger than any underground hazard. Their children, now grown, urged them to accept the buyout. "We can't lose you," one said. "We can rebuild memories anywhere, but we can't rebuild you." The couple's nightly arguments were filled with pauses, glances at the cracked foundation, and the faint hiss from below. Each moment carried the weight of decades, the pull of familiarity, and the undeniable presence of danger. It was not just the Millers who faced moral tension. Entire streets were split between movers and stayers, creating subtle friction and forcing neighbors to confront uncomfortable truths about fear, attachment, and survival. The buyouts revealed more than physical risk. They exposed deep psychological currents. Residents who left reported guilt for abandoning neighbors. Those who stayed experienced growing anxiety, a constant awareness of the fire beneath. Children who had once played freely on the streets now tiptoed across cracked asphalt. Adults inspected basements, vents, and smoke columns obsessively. Sleep became difficult, haunted by the quiet roar of an invisible inferno below. The underground fire had become a character itself, a silent force shaping every decision, every conversation, every memory. It dictated not only movement and safety, but also emotional states and social dynamics within the town. A few families, proud and determined, chose to remain. They reinforced foundations, measured gas levels, and adapted routines to mitigate risk. They learned to listen to the ground, noting subtle changes in temperature, color, and vibration. Even as streets emptied, these families walked carefully, tended gardens cautiously, and watched for steam rising from hidden vents. They had become intimately acquainted with the fire, respecting it, yet refusing to let it dictate their lives entirely. Their persistence highlighted human resilience, stubbornness, and the emotional complexity of leaving a home imbued with history and meaning. Even as families debated and relocated, the town itself bore visible signs of the fire's relentless presence. Cracks expanded, vents hissed, and faint orange glows appeared beneath asphalt. Steam drifted from backyards and abandoned streets, while neighbors observed cautiously from safe distances. Every corner of Centralia told a story of conflict between the fire and the earth, between safety and memory, between human attachment and natural forces. By late 1975, the dichotomy of Centralia was clear. Streets were partly empty, homes either abandoned or carefully maintained, and families lived with constant awareness of danger. Buyouts had offered safety, yet some stayed, choosing attachment over caution. The town's identity was reshaped, part ghost town, part resilient settlement. The underground fire beneath had dictated life for decades, but human choices determined how deeply fear and memory would intertwine. Centralia's story had become a lesson in compromise, courage, and moral complexity. It illustrated that survival is not always clear-cut, that sometimes the heart and the earth pull in opposing directions, and that communities must navigate both physical and emotional hazards simultaneously. At dusk, Centralia's streets appeared quiet yet alive. Faint smoke drifted from cracks in the pavement. Some homes glowed softly from evening lights, others stood dark, abandoned, windows staring like eyes. Families who had stayed walked carefully, observing subtle signs of heat and gas, while trucks loaded with belongings disappeared from streets, carrying away memories and possessions. The town had become a delicate balance of past and present, safety and attachment, fire and home. The underground inferno remained patient, creeping beneath foundations, watching, waiting, as Centralia's residents made choices that would define the town's legacy for decades.
Centralia had changed. What was once a bustling town, alive with children's laughter, morning routines, and the quiet hum of everyday life, had transformed into a place of emptiness. Streets that had carried generations of footsteps now lay silent, their asphalt cracked and uneven. Smoke rose faintly from fissures in the ground, a constant reminder that the fire beneath had not been tamed. Abandoned streets stretched for miles, lined with houses that had been left to decay. Front porches sagged, windows stared blankly, and the faint aroma of coal smoke lingered in the cold morning air. The town had become a museum of what once was, a snapshot of lives abruptly interrupted by a subterranean inferno that refused to die. By the late 1970s, families had largely evacuated. Trucks carrying furniture and belongings disappeared down Route 61, leaving behind homes stripped bare or simply locked and left to the elements. Streets were empty, sidewalks cracked, lawns overgrown, and mailboxes either toppled or filled with decades-old letters. Even pets had vanished. Dogs and cats, once common companions, had disappeared alongside their owners. Wildlife, cautious at first, began to reclaim the streets, slipping silently through the broken fences and shattered gardens. The abandoned houses of Centralia stood like silent witnesses. Doors hung crooked on their hinges. Windows reflected the sky without revealing life inside. Wallpaper peeled, revealing yellowed plaster. Personal belongings left in haste told faint stories. A toy doll missing an eye. A chair tipped over on the living room floor. A stack of newspapers from the day the buyouts had arrived. For those brave enough to walk the streets, the houses seemed to breathe, exhaling the memories and echoes of the families that once inhabited them. Each step on the cracked pavement carried the weight of absence, and the town's pulse felt slower, measured in the rhythm of faint smoke rising from hidden fissures below. Route 61, once a corridor of cars and conversation, had become a canvas for urban explorers and wandering travelers. Graffiti covered walls, guardrails, and abandoned signs. Messages varied, some mournful, some humorous, some cryptic warnings to the curious, beware the fire below, and Centralia sleeps, but it burns. The highway became both passage and monument, a place where the living acknowledged the ghostly remains of a town forced into partial oblivion. Tourists, students, and photographers ventured cautiously, cameras in hand, capturing the juxtaposition of beauty and decay.
Cracked streets told the story of neglect and nature's reclaiming. Asphalt buckled in patterns that resembled veins, steam occasionally escaping from hidden fissures. The sound of footsteps echoed strangely in the emptiness, sometimes accompanied by distant creaks or the subtle pop of underground heat pockets. Streetlights, mostly non-functional, cast long shadows in the early evening, turning simple intersections into scenes that felt both cinematic and eerie. Even the wind seemed to whisper, carrying faint scents of coal, sulfur, and abandoned homes. Though few remained, those who stayed were acutely aware of the absence around them. Tom and Sarah, the young couple near the outskirts, walked cautiously past empty houses, noting structural instability and small smoke vents. Their every movement was measured as though the ground itself might punish a misstep. Anna, the chronicler, continued documenting the town with meticulous detail. Her photographs captured empty porches, broken windows, and lawns overtaken by weeds. Her voiceover for visitors' guides reminded viewers that Centralia was a town of memory and caution, a place where history was both literal and figurative. Walking through Centralia was walking through a landscape of grief. The absence of neighbors, the silence of streets, and the hollow stares of abandoned houses created an emotional tension that weighed heavily on those who remained. Even the natural world seemed altered. Birds flew in unusual patterns, and the occasional deer paused cautiously near the smoke vents. The fire beneath continued to shape life above, silently dictating movement, behavior, and the rhythm of daily existence. Visitors often reported feeling uneasy as they explored. Some claimed to hear faint sounds of footsteps, the creak of doors, or children laughing in the distance. Others spoke of the smell of home-cooked meals long since abandoned. The town had become a liminal space, neither fully alive nor completely dead, suspended between memory and danger. Every photograph, every sketch, and every observation contributed to a growing narrative of Centralia as a ghost town alive with history and loss. A young journalist named Luke ventured into the heart of Centralia, camera in hand, notebook ready. He noticed a swing gently swaying in the abandoned playground. No children were present, yet the motion suggested a lingering presence, as if the memories of playtime persisted in the air. An elderly man, Mr. Foster, remained in his home near a faint smoke vent. He tended a small garden despite the heat below, walking carefully to avoid patches of unstable ground. Each day he watered flowers, recalling the laughter of grandchildren who had long since moved away. Steam rose in columns from cracks and fissures. Broken windows reflected pale sunlight. Mailboxes tilted at precarious angles. Sidewalks were overgrown with grass and weeds, sometimes hiding the glowing cracks below.
Occasionally, distant sounds echoed, a car horn from a passing tourist vehicle, a bird taking flight, or a faint metallic creak of an abandoned sign swaying in the wind. Silence filled the streets, broken windows reflecting the pale light, while faint movements, a distant car horn, a bird taking flight, the creak of a sign, added an eerie rhythm to the empty town. Centralia's empty streets were more than a warning. They were a mirror of human choices, attachments, and vulnerability.
The abandoned homes reflected resilience, stubbornness, and sometimes regret. Each remaining resident carried the weight of memories and the awareness of danger. Walking past empty porches or broken windows was a meditation on the passage of time, human persistence, and the quiet inevitability of change. The ghostly environment forced reflection not only on the fire beneath, but on the fragility of human settlements in the face of natural and man-made hazards. By twilight, Centralia's streets glowed faintly under soft evening light. Steam drifted from fissures in the pavement. Shadows lengthened across broken sidewalks and overgrown lawns. The abandoned houses seemed to lean toward each other, a silent congregation of memory and decay. Graffiti along Route 61 told stories in splashes of paint, warnings, jokes, art, and sorrow, capturing the essence of a town caught between past and present. The remaining residents moved cautiously, their steps deliberate. The underground fire below remained patient, a hidden force shaping every visual, every choice, and every memory. Centralia's empty streets were no longer just empty. They were alive with echoes, caution, and the haunting beauty of resilience against inevitable loss.
For decades, people have stared at Centralia's smoldering hillsides and asked the same question. How can a fire burn for more than 60 years? The truth lies far below the surface, in a world of heat, pressure, and ancient carbon that most people never think about. A coal seam fire isn't like a normal fire. It doesn't need open flames or a breeze to keep it alive. It moves silently through the underground, a slow, crawling creature feeding on layers of carbon-rich coal that have been buried for millions of years. Coal burns differently than wood or brush. When heated enough, it releases gases, methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide. Once a coal seam ignites, those gases feed the fire from within. They travel through cracks and fractures deep underground, carrying heat into new pockets of untouched coal. The fire expands like a living organism, constantly searching for fuel. And Centralia sits on one of the largest anthracite deposits in the country. Once the fire found its way into that ancient seam, the ground became one giant, interconnected network of tunnels, vents, and combustible rock. The fire didn't stay in one spot. It spread horizontally, moving beneath streets, backyards, basements, and forest edges. Sometimes it moved only a few feet a year. Other times, when it discovered a pocket of particularly rich coal, it surged forward rapidly. Residents had no way of knowing where the fire was at any moment. The ground could appear solid, only to collapse days later as the earth hollowed from the heat. The soil above an active seam could reach temperatures of over 900 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt plastic, warp metal, and send pillars of steam rising into the cold Pennsylvania air. Scientists and engineers tried to understand the path of the fire, drilling boreholes deep underground and lowering thermometers for readings. Sometimes they found temperatures so high that instruments failed. Other times they discovered invisible rivers of toxic gas drifting through fractures in the rock. The coal seam had become a labyrinth of danger, too unpredictable, too vast, too hot to control. To extinguish a fire like this, one would need to isolate every burning chamber from oxygen and then flood the entire network with inert materials or water. But Centralia seam stretched for miles. The cost to put out the fire was calculated in the tens of millions, far more than the state could ever justify for a town with a population that was rapidly declining. The fire didn't just burn coal. It consumed budgets, resources, and hope. The residents watched the landscape change.
Snow melted instantly in some places, but stayed untouched a few feet away. Trees died from the inside out, their roots cooked in the earth. Gas vents hissed steadily, releasing smoke that smelled of sulfur and scorched minerals. Birds avoided the area entirely. Animals that wandered too close sometimes never returned. It was as if the environment itself was being rewritten by the heat below. Experts explained that the fire was trapped in a geological corridor, a natural conveyor belt of carbon. Anthracite is one of the purest, hottest burning forms of coal, and the seams beneath Centralia were thick, dense, and ancient. Once any part of such a seam ignites, the fire becomes self-sustaining. It draws oxygen from cracks, abandoned mine shafts, and porous soil. Even when firefighters tried to smother small sections, the fire simply rerouted itself, slipping deeper underground and emerging somewhere else. Over time, the town realized a painful truth. This was not a fire that could be fought with hoses, sand, or bulldozers. It belonged to the earth now. It was older than the town, older than memory, older than anything humans had built above it. And once awakened, it refused to die. Scientists estimate the fire could burn for another 100 years, possibly 200. The coal beneath Centralia is that vast. Even if the flames slow, the heat and gases will linger long after every house has vanished. What was once a quiet coal mining community has become one of the strangest geological phenomena in America, a window into the raw, relentless power hidden beneath our feet. And yet, despite the destruction, there is something hauntingly mesmerizing about it. A fire with no flame, a disaster with no sound, a danger with no shape. It moves unseen, a reminder that the earth is always alive, always shifting, always capable of rewriting the world above. Centralia's endless fire is not just a tragedy, it is a mystery that continues to burn, slow, patient, and unstoppable.
A narrow road led them toward the outskirts of Centralia, a town that had not been quite alive for decades. The overgrown grass reached above their knees, brushing the edges of worn shoes. Faint tendrils of smoke rose from hidden cracks in the asphalt, weaving through morning fog like forgotten ghosts. Luke, the young journalist, adjusted his camera strap, notebook tucked under his arm. Beside him, Maria, an urban explorer with a fascination for abandoned spaces, scanned the horizon. Her eyes caught the tilt of a mailbox, leaning awkwardly toward the street, as though bowing to the town itself. "Looks like it's been frozen for years," Maria whispered, voice low, respectful. Luke nodded, raising the camera to frame a crooked house, its roof sagging, windows staring blankly. They moved slowly, each step cautious, mindful of uneven pavement and faint heat pockets beneath. Centralia was not just abandoned, it was alive in its absence. The wind carried the faint scent of coal smoke, sulfur, and wet earth, and each gust seemed to stir the memories of those who had left. Birds circled overhead, reluctant to settle. They reached the old playground near the center of town. A swing swayed gently, unprompted, creaking in rhythm with the wind. Luke crouched, adjusting the lens, trying to capture the uncanny motion. "This place," Maria said slowly. "It feels like it's waiting for something." Her hand hovered over a cracked bench, brushing away years of fallen leaves and dust. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by distant creaks from broken signs and the occasional pop of escaping steam from the asphalt. As they walked toward Route 61, abandoned storefronts loomed like sentinels. Graffiti sprawled across walls in bright, chaotic strokes. Some messages were humorous. "We left, but the fire stays."
Others were cryptic, "Beware the heat below." Luke lowered the camera, notebook open, jotting notes about how the town seemed suspended in a perpetual liminal state. Cars no longer passed, trains no longer rumbled. Time for Centralia seemed to have slowed, the streets holding memories like a breath caught in the chest. Further down, they noticed a home partially sunken into the earth. Its foundation had shifted, brick edges cracked, and a faint orange glow seeped from a vent near the kitchen. Maria instinctively took a step back. "I wonder if anyone stayed here," Luke murmured. He knelt beside a toppled chair, the upholstery faded and torn, and traced a hand over its surface, imagining the lives it had supported. The silence seemed to answer back, whispering faintly through the vent, a hissing reminder of the fire below. They moved on, stepping lightly over broken sidewalks and debris. Every house they passed had a story written in absence, a doll missing an eye, a newspaper stacked and yellowed, a window left open as if its owner might return at any moment. It was a town that spoke through what remained, not through what was gone. On the corner of Main Street, a faded diner sign creaked above the doorway. The windows, smeared with decades of dust, reflected the morning sun in fractured patterns. Luke adjusted his camera, capturing the light scattering over chipped paint and rusted metal. They paused near an old mailbox, still upright despite years of neglect. Letters inside had faded to near invisibility, ink blurred, envelopes yellowed. Maria reached in, lifting one out carefully, reading words that were decades old. "Hope you're safe." A sudden hiss broke the silence, steam escaping from a fissure just a few feet away. Luke jumped slightly, instinctively raising the camera. Maria smiled faintly, though unease lingered. They walked slowly toward the edge of town, past a church whose steeple leaned precariously. Inside, pews lay overturned, hymnals scattered across the floor. A single beam of light cut through a cracked window, illuminating dust motes that seemed to dance in slow motion. Near the train tracks, a rusted cart remained half buried in weeds. Its metal groaned faintly in the breeze. Luke photographed it from multiple angles, noting how nature had begun to reclaim the industrial past. Even wildlife had adapted to this quiet desolation. A lone deer stepped carefully across a cracked yard, nostrils flaring as it sensed warmth beneath the earth. A flock of birds flew overhead, calling softly to each other, hesitant to land. As they turned a corner, Luke noticed graffiti painted on the asphalt itself. "Centralia sleeps, but it burns." The words seemed to vibrate in the silence, carrying both warning and memory. They stopped at the edge of an abandoned schoolyard. Swings swayed gently in the wind. Faint chalk marks on the cracked pavement hinted at games once played. It was as if the children had left yesterday, not decades ago. Luke and Maria sat on a fallen bench, letting the atmosphere wash over them. Every sound, distant footsteps, a rustle of leaves, a low hiss from underground, reminded them that Centralia was not empty. It was a repository of memory, danger, and human choice. The town itself seemed to breathe, exhaling faintly from every crack and pavement and vent.
Maria whispered, "I feel like it's watching us." Luke nodded, unsure if it was the fire beneath or the weight of the past that pressed on them. Every step, every photograph, every note taken was an act of witnessing, a recognition of a town frozen yet alive. They wandered into a narrow alley, overgrown with weeds. Broken windows reflected the gray sky above. Steam drifted from a vent near a collapsed garage, carrying the faint scent of sulfur. A sudden gust rattled a rusted sign above, producing a low metallic creak.
Luke lifted the camera instinctively, framing the shot. Maria's footsteps echoed in the empty alley, a sound both startling and intimate in the quiet. They reached the outskirts, where the asphalt ended and overgrown tracks led into the forest beyond. Wildflowers had begun reclaiming the cracked roads, small patches of color in a gray, abandoned landscape. Luke paused, taking a long shot that captured both decay and resilience. As the sun began to dip, Centralia glowed faintly in the amber light. Smoke drifted lazily from fissures, painting the streets with pale columns of white and gray.
The town was silent, yet alive in ways that were not immediately visible, through shadows, echoes, and the memory of those who had lived there. Luke and Maria walked back toward the road, cameras full of images, notebooks full of observations. The town had not changed in decades, yet each visitor experienced it anew through the lens of human curiosity, caution, and imagination. Centralia remained a place frozen in time, yet endlessly alive, a ghost town that whispered stories to those willing to listen. Centralia in popular culture. Centralia was no longer merely a town, it had become a symbol. A place where smoke rose from cracks in the asphalt, and the streets seemed to breathe memories, danger, and silence simultaneously. Decades after the last families had left, the town's story began to seep into the wider imagination, inspiring artists, writers, and game designers alike. In a dimly lit studio in Japan, a group of game developers pored over photographs of Centralia. Ashen streets, abandoned houses, and drifting smoke inspired an entire digital world. Faint orange glows beneath cracked pavement were translated into haunting corridors of a fictitious town, streets that seemed endless, sidewalks that might crumble beneath one's feet. Centralia's underground fire became more than a geological hazard. It became myth. Developers and storytellers spoke of a town that burned unseen, a hidden menace shaping lives above ground. Its eeriness, subtle yet undeniable, lent itself to horror, suspense, and the uncanny. The game that emerged drew heavily from Centralia's atmosphere. Fog-filled streets, houses abandoned midlife, and shadows that seemed to linger longer than natural light allowed. Every corner, every alley carried a sense of unease, a whisper of history and danger beneath the feet of imagined inhabitants. Writers in distant cities also found inspiration in the town. Short stories, novels, and articles described Centralia not just as a real place, but as a metaphor. It became a cautionary tale about human hubris, about the consequences of ignoring environmental hazards, and about the persistence of memory in places abandoned. Legends grew around Centralia. Some said the town was haunted by the spirits of former residents, still tending gardens, walking sidewalks, or playing in the playgrounds that once echoed with laughter. Tourists reported strange sensations, sudden chills, faint footsteps, and the smell of coal smoke when no fire was visible. Urban explorers treated the town like a living museum. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing doors hanging crooked on their hinges, broken windows reflecting pale sunlight, and the faint glow of the earth beneath.
Graffiti along Route 61 became markers of modern myth, cryptic warnings, humorous commentary, and memorials to a town that refused to be entirely forgotten. Centralia even entered cinematic consciousness. Independent filmmakers recreated its streets in low-light settings, emphasizing silence, shadows, and smoke curling from fissures. The town's aesthetic, both decayed and alive, lent itself perfectly to stories where memory, danger, and the unseen collided. Tourists approached the town cautiously, aware of both its history and the risk of lingering heat and unstable ground. Some walked in silence, cameras ready, absorbing the atmosphere, noting every sagging porch, every leaning sign, and the faint hiss of steam venting from below. Others shared stories on blogs and social media, propagating Centralia's mythos for those who would never visit. The narrative of Centralia entered American pop culture gradually, but with lasting impact. Horror enthusiasts spoke of it as a town that inspired fear without needing ghosts. The danger beneath, invisible yet patient, became more terrifying than any apparition, a metaphor for the unseen consequences of human neglect. Even music artists referenced Centralia. Songs captured the feeling of wandering empty streets, of memory clinging to abandoned homes, of heat and smoke weaving through alleys. Lyrics evoked a liminal space between life and ghost, memory and oblivion. In classrooms, Centralia became a case study. Students learned not only about mining accidents and underground fires, but also about human psychology, attachment to place, and cultural memory. Stories of the town were used to illustrate how the environment shapes narrative and how real events can inspire myth and legend. Local chroniclers like Anna were approached by documentarians. Her notes, photographs, and sketches became essential for recreating the town accurately in books, films, and games. Her meticulous observations ensured that Centralia's story remained grounded in truth, even as it became a canvas for creative reinterpretation. Luke, the young journalist who had visited decades earlier, returned to document its evolution in pop culture. He walked the streets, now dotted with curious visitors, cameras capturing every detail, sketchbooks filled with faint smoke and leaning porches. He noticed a pattern. Centralia's emptiness amplified the imagination, making legends feel tangible and myths feel real. Tourists often spoke in hushed tones. "Do you hear that?" one would whisper, as a faint hiss echoed from under asphalt. Others joked nervously, "I think the town's alive," half serious, half afraid. Urban explorers left traces, graffiti, chalk drawings, or small tokens marking their visit. Some memorialized Todd Domboski, the boy who had once nearly fallen into a hidden sinkhole. Others left cryptic messages, "Respect the fire below," "Centralia remembers," "Ghost Town of Memory." Filmmakers, inspired by Centralia's eerie aura, recreated its streets in virtual simulations. Video games, indie films, and animated shorts captured its fog-laden alleys, abandoned playgrounds, and leaning houses. Players and viewers alike felt the tension of living above a hidden inferno, a story told visually, emotionally, and interactively. Ghost stories grew naturally around the town. Visitors claimed to feel a presence in empty houses, to hear children laughing faintly on deserted streets, to sense the town breathing under their feet. Even skeptics admitted an uneasy feeling, a palpable awareness that Centralia was alive in absence, shaped as much by memory as by fire. Cultural references spread further. Comic books, novels, and YouTube documentaries explored Centralia. The town became shorthand for abandonment, hidden danger, and the haunting beauty of decay. Each retelling added layers, legend, fact, fiction, and personal experience intertwined seamlessly. Some visitors came seeking fear. Others sought inspiration. Some simply wanted to witness history frozen in a town that had been transformed by fire and memory. Despite decades of exposure, Centralia retained its power to unsettle.
to provoke awe, to inspire art. Its streets were quiet, yet alive with echoes. Its history, both tragic and captivating, had entered global consciousness, a living legend shaped by real events. Luke and Maria sat on a cracked sidewalk, cameras resting, notebooks filled. The wind carried faint hisses from underground. They watched a swing sway gently in the abandoned playground, a reminder that memory lingers even where life has left. The town's popularity and culture also served as a warning. It reminded the world that human settlements are fragile, that the past shapes the present, and that invisible forces, whether fire, decay, or memory, cannot be ignored. Centralia became an emblem, part cautionary tale, part myth, part inspiration. By twilight, the streets glowed faintly in amber light. Steam drifted from hidden fissures. Photographers captured the scene, writers scribbled notes, and visitors walked slowly, absorbing the weight of history and imagination. The town of Centralia remained, neither fully alive nor entirely dead. Its presence shaped stories, games, legends, and memories. It existed as a bridge between reality and myth, between history and imagination, teaching all who visited that even in absence, a place can command attention, inspire art, and haunt the human psyche. The town that sleeps, but the earth does not.
Not quiet like a town on a Sunday morning, filled with the soft hum of activity and children's laughter, but a silence that carried weight. The streets were cracked, the houses leaning, and the air held a faint scent of coal smoke, lingering stubbornly as if the town itself refused to forget the fires beneath. By the late 1980s, Centralia had become almost unrecognizable to anyone who had grown up there. Families had mostly departed, trucks hauling decades of possessions down Route 61, leaving behind homes locked or abandoned to the slow decay of time and elements. Even the local school, once a hub of laughter and learning, sat silent, its windows dark, its doors barely hanging on rusted hinges. Yet, beneath the asphalt, under foundations and gardens, the earth did not rest. The underground fire, patient and relentless, continued its invisible work, slowly consuming coal seams, twisting tunnels, and unseen chambers beneath the sleeping town. It was an inferno without flame, a presence that demanded respect not through sight or sound, but through awareness of absence. Tourists wandered cautiously along Route 61. Some came for curiosity, some for photography, and others, drawn by urban legend, sought to witness a town that had literally burned beneath its feet. They walked past abandoned porches, noting the sagging wood and the faded wallpaper visible through broken windows. Steam drifted from cracks in the asphalt like faint ghosts of the town's former life. Occasionally, a soft hiss would sound from a vent, startling even those accustomed to the town's eerie rhythm. Every step felt deliberate. Each observer sensed that beneath the calm surface, the earth pulsed with quiet power, unyielding and unbending. Among the few remaining residents was Mr. Foster, the elderly gardener who had refused the government buyouts decades ago. He walked carefully along his property, noting subtle shifts in the lawn and changes in steam patterns. Every morning he tended flowers that stubbornly bloomed despite heat from below, a living defiance in a town ruled by absence and subterranean fire. Anna, the town's chronicler, continued her work, photographing and recording the slow evolution of Centralia. Her notes detailed the gradual expansion of cracks, the occasional faint glow beneath the pavement, and the changes in vegetation reclaiming yards once meticulously cared for.
She often remarked that the town seemed alive in a way that defied simple observation, a heartbeat beneath silence, a memory beneath emptiness. Even the wildlife adapted. Deer moved cautiously through empty streets, birds flew in unusual patterns, and small animals explored the abandoned homes, unbothered by the absence of humans, but aware somehow of the persistent heat below. Nature was reclaiming Centralia slowly, quietly, and in a manner that highlighted the fragile balance between human settlements and the earth itself. Visitors often reported uncanny experiences. A swing in the abandoned playground might sway despite the absence of wind. Footsteps echoed in the hollow streets, and faint laughter seemed to follow those who lingered too long in the town's quiet corners. Some researchers came with instruments, measuring gas emissions and ground temperatures. Their readings confirmed what residents had long known. The fire continued, patient and unpredictable. Yet the town above appeared calm, almost serene, a paradox of life and hazard coexisting in suspended tension. Route 61, lined with graffiti, became both pathway and narrative. Words painted in bright colors carried warnings, jokes, or memorials. Respect the fire below. Centralia remembers. A town that sleeps, but the earth does not. For visitors, the highway was a liminal space, bridging the past of a vibrant town with the present of ghostly absence. The story of Centralia also lived in digital realms. Video games recreated its streets, novels referenced its eerie presence, and documentaries highlighted its slow, almost imperceptible decay. The town became emblematic of resilience and fragility, a lesson in patience and vigilance, a cautionary tale translated into myth and media. Among the remaining few, daily life required awareness, precision, and ritual. Tom and Sarah, who had stayed near the outskirts, measured the ground before walking, checked for subtle hissing from vents, and moved objects cautiously. Each day was a negotiation with a force that had outlasted generations, a reminder that the earth beneath could not be tamed. The town had become a canvas of memory, absence, and eerie beauty. Empty homes whispered stories through broken windows and peeling wallpaper. Sidewalks cracked and overgrown seemed to exhale the lives that had once walked upon them. Luke, the journalist who had documented Centralia decades earlier, returned one evening. His camera captured faint orange glows beneath asphalt fissures, his notebook filled with observations that bridged fact and impression. He remarked that the town's real power was not in its abandonment, but in the persistent presence of the fire below, patient, untamed, and eternal. The interplay of memory, human absence, and subterranean hazard created a unique atmosphere. Visitors felt the weight of history and imagination intertwined. Stories of nearly lost children, evacuated families, and steadfast holdouts echoed through the empty streets, layering meaning atop smoke and stone.
At night, Centralia seemed to sleep. Streetlights, few and dim, cast long shadows. Steam rose in ghostly columns, curling toward the dark sky, and the faint smell of coal lingered, a reminder that the earth beneath had not stopped, would not rest. The remaining residents often paused, standing in the middle of cracked streets, listening to the faint hiss of venting gases and reflecting on the choices that had led them to stay. Some carried guilt for abandoning neighbors. Others carried pride for resilience and memory. Centralia had become a meditation on impermanence. The town itself was a reminder that human settlements, no matter how cherished, are fleeting against the persistence of natural and man-made forces. Yet, even in absence, it commanded attention, respect, and reverence. The town slept, yes, but the earth below moved. Fires burned slowly. Coal seams collapsed, and the ground shifted imperceptibly, as if reminding all who entered that life above ground is always contingent, always temporary. Centralia existed in a state of liminality, suspended between past and present, human ambition and natural will, silence and motion. Graffiti, rusted signs, and abandoned porches told stories to anyone who chose to observe. Every step was a dialogue with the invisible fire, every breath a reminder of fragility, every photo a meditation on memory. Even the faintest movements, the sway of a swing, the rustle of weeds, carried meaning. Visitors left carrying images, words, and impressions that lingered far beyond the town. Centralia inspired art, literature, and reflection. It taught that even a sleeping town, abandoned and empty, could command attention, respect, and emotion. As the sun set, shadows deepened across cracked streets and overgrown lawns. Steam drifted in thin ribbons, catching the last light. Centralia, the town that slept, existed in quiet dialogue with the fire below, a presence that was patient, unrelenting, and eternal. Even as humans moved on, the earth continued its silent work, a reminder that beneath the calm surface, life and force persist. Centralia's legacy was no longer just in buildings or streets, but in memory, myth, and the quiet persistence of the natural world. The town slept, but the earth did not.